Forget everything you think you know about why avoidants pull away, because the conversation almost always goes the same direction. The anxious partner reaches, the avoidant retreats, the distance grows, and somewhere in the analysis of that cycle, the conclusion gets drawn that empaths and avoidance are simply incompatible, that the empath's sensitivity is the problem, that feeling deeply, perceiving acutely, loving with the full and sometimes overwhelming force of a person who was built to attune, that these qualities are the reason the avoidant runs. That conclusion is wrong. Not partially wrong. Fundamentally, consequentially, damage-inflicting wrong. Because it takes the empath's greatest capacity and reframes it as their fatal flaw. It tells the most perceptive people in any room that their perception is the problem. It tells the people most capable of genuine connection that their depth is what makes connection impossible. And then those people spend years trying to feel less, trying to perceive less, trying to sand down the edges of an extraordinary sensitivity because they have been told, in the language of relationship dynamics and attachment theory, that who they are is simply too much for the person they love. Here is the truth that changes everything. There is one specific type of empath that does not send the avoidant running, one specific configuration of sensitivity and selfhood that the avoidant nervous system does not experience as threat, one type that the avoidant, often to their own bewilderment, cannot dismiss, cannot detach from, cannot retreat from with the clean efficiency they bring to every other close relationship. And it is probably not the type you think. First, why most empaths trigger the avoidance retreat. To understand what works, you have to understand what doesn't. And why the empath who struggles most in avoidant relationships is not struggling because they feel too much. They are struggling because of what they do with what they feel. Specifically, they do something that is natural, understandable, deeply human, and profoundly activating to the avoidant nervous system. They absorb. The absorbing empath takes in the emotional world of the people around them with a porousness that has no real boundary. They feel the avoidance discomfort as their own discomfort. They feel the avoidance distance as a weight they are somehow responsible for lifting. They register the avoidance unspoken need, because the absorbing empath always registers unspoken need. It is one of their most fundamental capacities, and they move toward it, instinctively, immediately, often before they have consciously identified what they are responding to. This movement toward the wound, toward the need, toward the unspoken thing is experienced by the absorbing empath as love, as care, as the most natural expression of who they are. But the avoidance nervous system does not receive it as love. It receives it as exposure, because the avoidance deepest protection is the belief that their interior is private, that the wound is hidden, that the need, that shameful, dangerous, deeply buried need, cannot be seen. And the absorbing empath, in their instinctive movement toward exactly that hidden place, dismantles that protection without even trying. The avoidant doesn't think, this person sees me and I am grateful. They think, this person sees me and I am unsafe. And they leave, not because the empath was wrong about what they perceived, but because being perceived that accurately, that intimately, that immediately, without any of the gradual consent-based process of chosen vulnerability, feels to the avoidant nervous system like being ambushed by intimacy. So the absorbing empath, who loves more carefully and attentively than almost anyone, ends up triggering the very retreat they were trying to prevent. The empath types that don't work, and why there are several configurations of empathic sensitivity that consistently produce the anxious avoidance spiral. Not because these empaths are flawed, but because the way their sensitivity is expressed maps directly onto the avoidance alarm system. The empath who reads emotions and immediately responds to them, who cannot perceive distress without being compelled to address it, creates an environment where the avoidant never has room to manage their own interior. Every emotional signal is caught and reflected back before the avoidant has had time to process it themselves. This feels to the avoidant like being emotionally managed, like their inner world is under constant surveillance. The care is real, The effect is claustrophobic. The empath who takes on the avoidance pain as their own, who cannot separate their emotional state from the emotional state of the person they love, creates a dynamic where the avoidance withdrawal becomes the empath's crisis. And the empath in crisis is a person who reaches, who seeks reassurance, who needs the avoidance presence to stabilize what the avoidance absence destabilized. The avoidant, already retreating, now has the additional weight of the empath's distress to navigate, and the easiest response to additional weight for someone whose primary coping mechanism is distance is more distance. The empath who uses their perception as a tool for connection, who says what they see, who names the avoidance emotional experience back to them, who believes that if the avoidant only understood that they were safe to be vulnerable, they would choose vulnerability, creates the most acute trigger of all, because naming someone's wound without their permission is not intimacy, it is invasion. However lovingly intended, the avoidant did not consent to being seen that clearly, and the clarity itself becomes the thing they flee. All of these empaths are loving. All of them are genuine. All of them are doing what their sensitivity naturally produces, and all of them, in the context of an avoidant relationship, are doing the thing that makes retreat inevitable. The one type that changes everything, there is a different kind of empath, rarer, less discussed, often misunderstood even by the people who are this type, because they have spent their lives being told their sensitivity should look a particular way, and what they are doesn't fit the template. This type feels just as deeply, perceives just as acutely, has the same exquisite attunement to the emotional world around them that characterizes every form of empathic sensitivity. But something in the architecture of how they hold that sensitivity is fundamentally different. They have a container, not a wall, not a defense, not the managed, performed emotional unavailability that some people develop in response to being hurt. A genuine, robust, self-built interior container, the capacity to feel something fully without being destabilized by it, to perceive someone else's emotional experience without absorbing it as their own, to see into the wound without needing to immediately move toward it. This is the boundaried empath, and the boundaried empath does something to the avoidant nervous system that no other type of person consistently manages to do. They make the avoidant feel seen without feeling trapped. What the boundaried empath actually is. The word boundaried gets misused constantly. It gets associated with coldness, with emotional unavailability, with the kind of careful self-protection that is actually just another form of armor. People hear boundaried and think closed off, guarded, someone who has decided feeling is too expensive and has invested in emotional efficiency instead. That is not this. The boundaried empath is not less sensitive than other empaths. They are sensitive in a way that has been integrated rather than simply experienced. They have done, usually through some combination of difficulty, self-reflection, and deliberate inner work, the labor of separating their own emotional experience from the emotional experiences they perceive in others. They can feel the room without becoming the room. They can sense the wound without being wounded by proximity to it. They can know that someone is in pain without converting that knowledge into an urgent personal mission to fix it. This distinction between perceiving and absorbing, between knowing and being compelled, is the entire difference. And it produces a quality of presence that is unlike anything the avoidant has previously encountered, because the boundaried empath can sit with the avoidant's pain without the pain becoming an emergency, can register the avoidance withdrawal without the withdrawal becoming a crisis, can see the wound clearly and compassionately, and simply wait. Hold the space, be present with what is, without needing it to immediately be something different. For the avoidant, who has spent their entire relational life bracing for the moment their interior gets exposed and someone rushes in with the overwhelming force of their care, this quality of still, undemanding witness is almost shockingly unfamiliar, and unfamiliar, for once in a way that doesn't activate the alarm. The quality of presence that disarms the avoidant. The avoidant has a highly developed sensitivity of their own, Not emotional sensitivity in the felt sense, but the nervous system's sensitivity to what other people want from them, to what the situation is requiring of them emotionally, to what the cost of continued presence is going to be. In most close relationships, the avoidant is constantly subconsciously calculating that cost. Every expression of need has a price tag. Every moment of intimacy carries the implicit question, what will be required of me if I stay? The closer someone gets, the higher the projected cost. The louder the alarm, the more urgent the need to find the exit. But in the presence of the boundaried empath, the calculation produces a different result, because the boundaried empath is not presenting a bill. They are not arriving at intimacy with an implicit invoice for reciprocation. Their care is not conditional on a particular response. Their presence does not carry the low-level pressure of someone whose emotional stability depends on the avoidance consistency. They are simply there, genuinely, warmly, perceptively there, and not needing the avoidant to be anywhere other than exactly where they are. This is disorienting for the avoidant, pleasantly, confusingly, persistently disorienting, because they have been waiting, as they always wait in every close relationship, for the cost to arrive, for the need to surface, for the moment when the warmth becomes conditional, and the expectations become visible, and the familiar weight of being someone's emotional lifeline settles over the relationship. And it doesn't come, not because the boundaried empath doesn't have needs. They do. But their needs come from a place of already established inner stability. They are expressed as genuine desires rather than as barely contained desperation. They can wait. They can be stated and then released. They do not have the quality of emergency that the avoidance nervous system has learned to flee. The avoidant keeps waiting for the trap, and in the waiting, they lean in closer, because something in them, the part that genuinely wants connection, the part that the wound never fully extinguished, is recognizing that this might finally, inexplicably be safe. How the boundaried empath sees the avoidant differently. Here is where the specificity of this type matters most. The ordinary empathic response to perceiving an avoidance wound is compassion directed at the wound, the absorption of it, the immediate, caring, ultimately counterproductive rush toward the most tender place, with everything the empath has. The boundaried empath perceives the wound, sees it with complete clarity, perhaps more clearly than the avoidant can see it themselves, and responds differently. They respond to the whole person, not just the wound. This is a distinction so simple, it sounds almost too obvious to name, but in practice, it is everything. Because the avoidant who has been in previous relationships, therapeutic or romantic, is accustomed to their wound being the primary object of attention, to being understood primarily in terms of their avoidance. As a person with an attachment pattern, a person with a fear of intimacy, a person whose behavior is explained by the wound, and therefore always, in some subtle way, defined by it. The boundaried empath sees the wound and also sees everything else, the intelligence, the dry humor, the way they think about things, the genuine warmth that surfaces in unguarded moments. The person who exists underneath the defense system, not instead of it, not in spite of it, but alongside it, full and complex and worth knowing in their entirety. And the avoidant, who has been so long defined by their avoidance, who has either been pathologized by people who want to fix them, or enabled by people who have organized their own behavior around accommodating the pattern encounters, perhaps for the first time, someone who sees the pattern and is simply not that impressed by it, not dismissive, not challenging, not pushing for change, just not organized around it, not making it the central fact. That refusal to be defined by the avoidance wound is one of the most profoundly attractive things the boundaried empath does, because it implicitly says, you are more than this. I can see you are more than this, and I am going to keep relating to the more than this, regardless of whether the wound tries to make itself the whole story. The silence they can sit in together. One of the most reliable tests of relational safety for an avoidant is silence, not conversational silence, the kind that happens between sentences, but the deeper silence of two people simply existing together, without the need to perform, to fill space, to manage the emotional atmosphere. The silence that arises when both people are genuinely comfortable in their own skin, in the same room, without any pressure for the moment to mean something, or produce something, or go somewhere. Most people cannot pass this test with an avoidant, not because they are bad at silence, but because their silence is effortful. It is the silence of someone who wants to speak, but is holding back, of someone monitoring whether the quiet is okay, whether the avoidant is still present, whether the lack of interaction means something is wrong. That kind of silence has a texture to it, a charged, monitored, slightly anxious texture that the avoidant can feel as clearly as they can feel words. The boundaried empath passes the silence test, not because they have nothing to say, but because their silence is genuine. They are actually comfortable in their own experience, actually at home in the present moment, actually unbothered by the absence of constant verbal connection. Their quiet is inhabited rather than effortful. It has the quality of someone who is simply present, not waiting, not monitoring, not calculating, just here. And in that shared inhabited silence, the avoidance nervous system does something rare. It rests. The alertness that is usually running, the constant low-level scanning for emotional demand, for the cost of presence, for the signs that intimacy is about to require something they cannot give, goes quiet. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. Enough that something in the avoidant opens incrementally in the direction of genuine presence. The boundaried empath does not engineer that opening. They simply create the conditions for it. And then they wait, not with the charged waiting of someone desperate for the opening to happen, but with the patient, undemanding presence of someone who knows that some things unfold in their own time, and that their worth is not contingent on the speed of the unfolding. What the avoidant does next, the avoidant, in the presence of the boundaried empath, does something they almost never do voluntarily. They start to move toward the intimacy rather than away from it, not dramatically, not with sudden declarations of vulnerability or abrupt dismantling of the defenses they have maintained for decades, but incrementally, almost imperceptibly, in small, unannounced, sometimes unconscious movements in the direction of genuine closeness. They mention something real, something that matters to them, not a performance of depth, not a strategic disclosure, but an actual piece of their interior that slips out in a moment of genuine ease, and they watch what happens. Watch whether the boundaried empath pounces on it, makes it significant, turns it into an opening for the kind of deep emotional excavation that the avoidance system dreads. The boundaried empath receives it, simply, warmly, without amplification, acknowledges it without dramatizing it, and moves on. And the avoidant, who was braced for the pounce, finds themselves slightly surprised and slightly more open. This happens again and again. Each time the avoidant tests, consciously or not, whether this person is going to do what everyone else does, whether the safety is real or provisional, whether the ease will eventually give way to the familiar weight of emotional demand. And each time, the boundaried empath simply continues being what they are, present, perceptive, unhurried, unbothered by the avoidance pace, unshaken by the avoidance occasional retreats, genuinely, unperformatively themselves, regardless of what the avoidant does or doesn't do in response. And something in the avoidant, ancient and defended and accustomed to siege, begins, slowly and without fanfare, to lower the arms. Becoming this, if you are not already here, is the question that has been underneath this entire conversation. Can this be learned? Can someone who is currently the absorbing empath, the one whose sensitivity compels them toward the wound, whose love rushes in without waiting for permission, whose sense of self becomes entangled with the emotional state of the person they love, become the boundaried empath? Yes, with significant honesty about what it requires. It requires the most difficult thing a deeply feeling person can undertake, learning to feel without being governed by what you feel. Learning to perceive someone's pain without that perception immediately converting into obligation. Learning to love someone without making their state of being the thermostat for your own. It requires therapy for most people, not because there is something wrong with you, but because the patterns that produce the absorbing empath were installed early and run deep. The tendency to take on others' emotional experiences as your own usually has roots in a childhood environment where your sensitivity was the mechanism by which you monitored safety, where reading the room was not a gift, but a survival skill, where you learned to attune to others because attuning was what kept you safe, or kept someone you loved stable, or kept the atmosphere of your home manageable. Unlearning a survival skill is not simply a matter of deciding to. It requires understanding where the skill came from, what need it was serving, whether that need is still real, or whether you are still running an old program in a new context that doesn't require it. It requires building, deliberately, intentionally, with real investment, the kind of interior life that does not depend on external emotional weather for its stability. The practices, the relationships, the self-knowledge, the daily habits of return to your own center that make you someone who is genuinely grounded, not performing groundedness, actually having it. And it requires learning, perhaps the hardest part, to let people have their own experience, to see the avoidant in pain and not fix it, not absorb it, not organize your behavior around reducing it, to trust that they are capable of their own interior, that they do not require you to manage it for them, that the most loving thing you can sometimes offer is the space to figure themselves out without your constant, caring, ultimately destabilizing intervention. This is not becoming less empathic. It is becoming more integrated, more fully in possession of the extraordinary gift your sensitivity represents, and less at the mercy of what that sensitivity perceives. The one thing that brings them to their knees. Everything here has been moving toward a single point. The one quality, the one configuration, the one way of being that the avoidant, with all their defenses and all their distance and all their practiced self-sufficiency, genuinely cannot resist. It is not grand romantic gesture, not patience that endures everything, not the willingness to love them through their worst behavior in the hope that love will eventually be enough. It is a person who sees them completely, feels everything about them, the wound, the fear, the guarded places, the tender interior hidden beneath the self-containment, and is entirely, utterly, unshakably unbothered by any of it. Not unbothered in the sense of indifferent, unbothered in the sense of undefeated by it, undestabilized, unchanged in their own sense of self, uncompelled to fix or flee or absorb, just there, seeing the full truth of the avoidant, feeling the full weight of it, and standing in it without needing it to be different. That quality, that specific, rare, deeply cultivated combination of total perception and total equanimity is what brings the avoidant to their knees, not metaphorically. In the actual, real, interior sense of a person encountering something they have never encountered before and recognizing it as the thing they did not know they were looking for. Because the avoidant has spent their entire life managing what other people see of them, controlling the exposure, maintaining the narrative of self-sufficiency that keeps the wound private and the walls intact. And the boundaried empath looks through all of it, sees everything, and stays, not because they need to, not because they cannot do otherwise, but because what they see, the whole complicated, wounded, extraordinary truth of the person in front of them, is genuinely worth staying for. And the avoidant, who has never before been fully seen without being made to feel that the seeing was a burden they needed to resolve, feels, for perhaps the first time in their life, the specific and revolutionary relief of being known. That relief is what changes everything. Not a technique, not a strategy, not a modified version of yourself carefully calibrated to avoid their triggers. Just you, fully feeling, firmly grounded, clearly seeing and entirely your own, standing in the truth of who they are without flinching. That is the thing they cannot walk away from. That, finally, is the thing that makes them stay. This one empath type brings avoidance to their knees. There is still something left to say. Everything covered so far has been building toward a portrait, of the boundaried empath, of what they do to the avoidance nervous system, of why their specific configuration of sensitivity and selfhood creates the only relational environment in which the avoidant can genuinely lower their defenses. The portrait is accurate, but a portrait is static, and what hasn't been addressed yet is the living, breathing daily reality of what it means to be this person, not the concept of it, the texture of it, the difficulty of it, the specific internal experience of someone who feels everything and has learned through real work, real loss, real excavation of their own interior to hold what they feel without being held hostage by it, because becoming the boundaried empath is not a destination that gets reached and then maintained effortlessly. It is a practice, ongoing, imperfect, sometimes exhausting, occasionally exhilarating. And understanding that practice, what it actually requires on an ordinary Tuesday, in a moment of genuine hurt, when the avoidant does the thing that avoidants do, and everything in you wants to respond in the old way, is the part that turns understanding into something livable. The moment the old pattern calls you back, you will be in a moment. Perhaps you have already been in this moment. Perhaps you are in it right now, where everything you understand about being boundaried meets the full force of what you actually feel, and the understanding loses, not permanently, not catastrophically, but in the specific, immediate, visceral way that theory always loses to the body when the body is frightened, or hurting, or lonely. The avoidant will go quiet, or pull back, or respond with a particular flatness that you have learned to recognize as their emotional retreat. And something in you, the old, well-worn, deeply grooved part that learned long ago that someone's distance is something you caused, and therefore something you must fix, will fire. The pull toward them will be immediate and strong, and will feel, in that moment, almost indistinguishable from love. But it is not love, or not only love, it is also the old survival program running, the pattern that says, someone is withdrawing, which means something is wrong, which means you need to move toward them, which means whatever you were doing or feeling or needing needs to stop immediately while you address the emergency of that distance. The boundaried empath is not someone who never feels that pull. They feel it, often intensely. The sensitivity that makes them extraordinary does not switch off in moments of relational stress. If anything, it amplifies because they feel the avoidance withdrawal as clearly as they feel anything else, and feeling it is not the same as being governed by it. The practice, the actual, daily, unglamorous practice of being boundaried, lives in that gap between feeling the pull and acting on the pull, between perceiving the withdrawal and organizing your entire self around responding to it. In that gap, something has to happen. A breath, a return to your own body, a question, is this mine or am I absorbing theirs? A moment of honest self-location that asks, what do I actually feel underneath the reactive urge? What do I actually need, separate from what their distance is triggering in me? That question, asked in the moment of maximum pull, is the practice, not the answer to it. The asking, what boundaries actually feel like from me inside? Boundaries get described almost universally in terms of what they keep out. The language around them is protective, defensive, structural, walls with doors, lines that shouldn't be crossed, limits that are set and enforced. And that language, while not wrong, misses the felt quality of what a genuine boundary actually is in the interior experience of the person who has one. A real boundary does not feel like a wall. It feels like a floor. It is the solid ground beneath your feet that allows you to stand somewhere without being swept away. Not a barrier between you and another person, but a stable surface within yourself from which you can engage fully, feel deeply, give generously without losing your footing. The person without that interior floor can still engage, still feel, still give, but they are doing it while standing in water. Everything is slightly precarious. Every strong current, every withdrawal, every silence, every moment of emotional intensity threatens to take them off their feet. And so they are constantly exhaustingly calculating how to stay upright, how to manage the current, how to avoid the depth where the water goes over their head. The boundaried empath has the floor. They can go into the deep water, feel everything, engage with full emotional presence, allow genuine intimacy, and return to standing. Not because the deep water doesn't affect them, but because they know where the floor is. They can find their feet. Building that floor is the work, the real work, underneath all the language about selfishness and self-possession and not organizing around the avoidance responses. All of that is only possible if the floor exists, and the floor is built through a specific kind of inner labor that cannot be shortcut and cannot be borrowed from someone else's blueprint. The inner labor that builds the floor gets built through repeated, deliberate return to yourself, not through discipline in the punishing sense, not through forcing yourself to feel less, or respond less, or care less, but through the practice of when something happens, when a feeling arises, when the pull toward the old pattern fires, pausing, locating yourself, finding the interior before responding to the exterior. This sounds simple. In practice, for someone whose sensitivity has always been oriented primarily outward, toward other people's states, other people's needs, other people's emotional temperature, it is genuinely difficult because turning attention inward in the midst of relational stress goes against every instinct that the absorbing empathist has ever developed. The instinct is always to look out, to scan the other person, to find the answer to what's happening by reading the room rather than reading yourself. The practice is interrupting that, firmly but without self-punishment, noticing, I just oriented entirely outward. Where am I? What do I feel? Not what do they feel? Not what does this mean about the relationship? Not what should I do? But simply, what is actually happening in my own body right now? That question, asked consistently, builds something over time. A habit of self-location, a reflex of return, a growing familiarity with your own interior that makes it less frightening to visit during difficulty, because you have been there enough in the easier moments that you know the terrain. Therapy accelerates this for most people, not because the therapist has access to something you don't, but because the therapeutic relationship itself provides the practice in a contained, structured way. It is a relationship where turning attention inward is the entire point, where someone sits with you in the looking rather than redirecting you outward, where the habit of self-location gets practiced weekly, consistently, with enough safety that it gradually becomes available outside the therapy room as well. But therapy is not the only path. The floor can be built through meditation, through journaling that is genuinely self-investigative rather than narrative, through physical practices that return attention to the body, through any sustained discipline that teaches you to locate yourself before locating others. The specific path matters less than the consistency. The floor is built slowly, through return, and return, and return again. The difference between compassion and merger. The boundaried empath loves the avoidant when they love an avoidant, with compassion rather than merger. And this distinction, which can sound abstract, is in practice one of the most concrete and consequential differences in how a relationship is experienced by both people. Merger is what happens when an empath loves without the flaw, when the other person's experience becomes indistinguishable from their own, when the avoidance pain is felt as the empath's pain, when the avoidance distance is experienced as the empath's failing, when the avoidance emotional state becomes the primary weather system inside the empath's own interior. Merger feels, from the inside, like love. It feels like deep caring. It feels like the natural consequence of being someone who feels everything, that you feel the person you love everything, including their hurts and their fears and their defended places. But merger is not the same as love. It is love without a self, love that has dissolved the boundary between where you end and where they begin. And love without a self cannot sustain, cannot remain generous over time, cannot give from abundance, because there is no stable interior from which abundance can arise. The interior keeps being reorganized around the other person's state. Compassion is different. Compassion sees the pain, feels it genuinely, not at a managed distance, allows the felt quality of it to be real, and remains, throughout the feeling of it, a distinct person, someone who is moved but not swept away, someone who cares without being consumed, someone who can sit with the avoidance fear without becoming afraid, with their loneliness without becoming lonely on their behalf, with their wound without making the wound the center of the relationship. That quality of compassion, present, warm, genuinely feeling, and entirely unmerged, is what the avoidant encounters in the boundaried empath and cannot find anywhere else. Because most people who get close enough to feel the avoidance interior either flee it or are consumed by it. The boundaried empath does neither. They simply stay, feeling it alongside them, from a self that remains intact. And that staying, that specific, undemanding, undissolved staying, is the thing the avoidant has never before been offered, has perhaps never believed was possible. Why the avoidant comes back to this person? The avoidant will test the boundaried empath, not deliberately, not strategically, but the testing will happen. It is the nervous system doing what it always does, checking the cost of continued presence, scanning for the moment when the safety reveals itself as conditional. They will pull back, and the boundaried empath will not chase, not because the boundaried empath doesn't notice, not because they don't feel the withdrawal or have feelings about it, but because their response to the withdrawal is not organized around the avoidance comfort. It is organized around their own truth. And their truth in that moment is, I am not going to pursue someone who is retreating. I am going to return to my own life. I am going to trust that what is real between us does not require me to chase it into existence. And the avoidant retreats and finds in the retreat what they always find, the relief of distance, and then, beneath it, the gray, the flatness, the absence of color that signals the absence of the boundaried empath's particular quality of presence, and they come back, not dramatically, not with declarations, often just a small reach, a message, a question, a casual toned contact that is carrying more weight underneath it than the words suggest, a testing of whether the boundaried empath is still there, whether the non-chasing was rejection or simply genuine, simply the boundaried empath living their life in the avoidance absence as they live it in the avoidance presence, fully, without waiting. And the boundaried empath, who is genuinely not sitting by the phone, who genuinely has been living their life, responds, without drama, without the layered significance of someone who has been waiting to respond, simply, warmly, genuinely, from the same grounded place they always occupy. And the avoidant, who has been watching for the trap, for the accumulated resentment of the non-response period, for the guilt and the questions and the need to explain, finds instead the same person they left, unchanged, undiminished, still entirely themselves, and something in the avoidance calculation shifts, because this person, this specific unclassifiable, somehow both fully feeling and fully self-possessed person, is not behaving according to any relational pattern the avoidance nervous system has a prepared response to. They cannot be fled from, because fleeing doesn't destabilize them. They cannot be kept at managed distance, because their own distance is genuine rather than wounded. They cannot be related to as a potential threat, because their presence consistently fails to produce the cost the avoidant is always braced for. The avoidance system, stripped of its familiar defenses, finds itself, perhaps for the first time, simply in a relationship, without the drama of the anxious avoidant spiral, without the push and pull, without the exhausting performance of self-sufficiency against the backdrop of someone else's need. Just two people, one of whom feels everything and is undestabilized by it, the other of whom is learning, slowly and with genuine surprise, that closeness might not always cost them what they've spent their life believing it would. The thing that cannot be faked, everything described here, could theoretically be performed. The equanimity, the non-chasing, the apparent self-possession, These behaviors can be mimicked, and there are places in the world of relationship advice where exactly that mimicry is taught, where the boundaried empath is presented as a strategy rather than a way of being, where the specific behaviors are extracted from the interior truth that produces them and offered as techniques. This doesn't work, and it is worth being direct about why. Because the avoidance nervous system, which has been calibrated since childhood to detect the difference between genuine and performed, between real safety and manufactured safety, will find the seam, will notice the effort underneath the apparent ease, will register the distance between what is being presented and what is actually felt, will recognize, with the particular acuity of someone who has spent their life reading between relational lines, that what they are encountering is a technique rather than a person. And techniques, however skillfully executed, do not lower the avoidance defenses, they raise them. Because a technique is still organized around the avoidance response, still fundamentally reactive, still measuring itself against their behavior. And that orientation, however disguised, produces the same quality of pressure that all the more obvious forms of need produce. The only thing that actually works is the real thing, the genuine self-possession, the actual flaw, the real capacity to feel without merging, to perceive without being compelled, to love without dissolving. And that can only come from having done the work, from having genuinely excavated and integrated the patterns that produce the absorbing, merging, avoidant, organized way of loving, from having built, through real effort, real time, real return to yourself in moments of maximum pull, the interior stability that makes all of this not a performance, but simply who you are. There is no shortcut to that. It is the work of becoming, and it is the only path to the kind of love that the avoidant, and frankly, anyone worth loving, can genuinely receive. What? This asks of you. If you have listened to all of this and recognized yourself, either as someone who is already in some measure this type, or as someone who wants to become it, then you already know what it asks of you. It asks that you stop treating your sensitivity as something to be managed downward, that you stop apologizing for the depth of what you feel, that you stop confusing the problem, which was never your feeling, always your relationship to your feeling, with the gift, which is the feeling itself. It asks that you invest in your own interior with the same quality of attention and care that you have historically invested in other people's interiors, that you become as curious about your own experience as you are about theirs, that you develop, over time, the intimate familiarity with your own emotional landscape that makes you able to navigate it during difficulty rather than being navigated by it. It asks that you grieve the version of loving you have been doing, the absorbing, merging, self-erasing version, without self-judgment, because that version came from somewhere real. It was a response to something real, and it served you in the environments where it was developed, in ways that deserved acknowledgement before they are let go. It asks that you become someone whose fullness is genuine, whose life outside the relationship is not a performance of independence, but an actual, inhabited, deeply personal thing, whose sense of worth is located so thoroughly within themselves that the avoidance inconsistency cannot reach it, not because you have made yourself whole, but because you have made yourself whole. And it asks, the final thing, the hardest thing, that you bring all of that into relationship without holding any of it back, that you do not use your groundedness as protection, that you do not hide behind your equanimity as a way of managing your own vulnerability, that you remain, for all the floor you have built, for all the container you have cultivated, genuinely open, genuinely feeling, genuinely willing to be moved by the person in front of you, even knowing that being moved carries risk. Because the boundaried empath is not armored, they are rooted, and there is a world of difference between a person who cannot be hurt and a person who can be hurt and remain themselves. The avoidant knows that difference, feels it immediately, and responds to it slowly, tentatively, against every instinct of their defended nervous system, with the thing they have been withholding from every relationship that came before, their actual presence. not the managed version, not the self-contained, walls intact, carefully rationed version. The real one, the one that only surfaces when the nervous system finally, against all its conditioning, decides that it is safe to arrive. That is what you are capable of calling forth, not through strategy, not through technique, not through any modified version of yourself carefully constructed to avoid their triggers, through the simple, radical, endlessly difficult act of being, completely, groundedly, feelingly, unshakably, yourself. That is the thing that brings them to their knees. And more importantly, far more importantly, it is the thing that finally, after everything, brings you home to yourself. That is where this ends, and where everything else begins.